Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2020 School Wellness Policy Summit. I'm Amanda Bloom, Director of Programs and Impact at the Health Education Council, which is the proud host of this summit. The Health Education Council is a nonprofit headquartered in West Sacramento, and we provide health and well-being services to underserved communities throughout the Sacramento region. The theme of this year's summit is striving for wellness in uncertain times. Over the next 3 weeks, we will provide a variety of online sessions designed to augment the hard work you are already doing to educate and support children and families during this time of COVID-19 and distance learning. We hope you will find new strategies, allies, and encouragement as you work to support the educational and mental health of students. Every Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m., we will present a live presentation and question and answer session with education and mental health leaders. You also have access to pre-recorded sessions through the video tab on the Whova platform. Please check the agenda tab for times when these speakers will be available for live questions and answers. We know that networking is one of the best things about conferences. We've tried to recreate this for you through a variety of meetup sessions on specific topics, discussion boards, and even happy hour events. Check out the community tab for a list of these events. Do you have a special topic you're eager to discuss with other attendees? You can set up your own meetup and discussion board through the community tab. Finally, we would like to acknowledge the funder of this summit, the USDA SNAP program, which is an equal opportunity provider and employer. You can visit www.cachampionsforchange.net. That's www.cachampionsforchange.net for healthy tips. I will now turn the platform over to Roxana Garcia Ochoa, who will introduce today's keynote speaker. Again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the summit.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roxana Garcia Ochoa. I am the interim program director for the Healthy Schools teams here at the Health Education Council. I'll go ahead and just remove my mask. We're practicing safe social distancing practices remotely here from our Health Education Council office. I am really happy to be here and excited to be able to introduce Dr. Staci Chimimba Ault. She is an assistant professor with the Division of Social Work at Sacramento State University. Her pronouns are she, her, and hers. Dr. Ault has over 20 years of experience working with children, families in the Sacramento area. She originally came to Sac State from Sacramento City Unified School District, where she served as the Youth Development Director for almost 10 years. In 2016, Dr. Ault founded the Race and Gender and Equity Project. Their mission is to harness individual and collective transformation through healing, education, advocacy, and research. Dr. Ault earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and her master's in social work at Sacramento State University, and her doctorate in international and multicultural education, human rights education from the University of San Francisco. She is a leader, coach, activist, healer, scholar, and mama to both her biological children and the young people in her community. Dr. Ault's scholarship revolves around critical post-traumatic growth among individuals and communities, as well as her examinations of Blackness and anti-Blackness communities and institutions. She conducts participatory action research alongside youth and community in order to effect change. We introduced her as today's keynote speaker for our critical post-traumatic growth presentation, which she'll talk about a framework for creating transformative spaces for ourselves and for our students. So Dr. Ault, whenever you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Roxanne. Thank you, Health Education Council. Thank you to all of you for having me. Roxanne is going to help me with my slides today because I am a horrible multitasker. Those of you who know me know that I cannot text and walk. I cannot chew gum and walk down the stairs. So Roxana is gonna help me with my slides today. We'll wait a few moments. Also, kind of logistically, there is a space in Whova, I think, where we can chat as well as here on Zoom. And so as we are moving through the presentation, I'm hoping that this will be interactive. I will get in the flow of talking. And so I'm going to really try to pause and engage with you and have conversation. But if you have questions or you need me to slow down, please jump in the chat. And Roxana is also going to help us determine question and answer both through the session and at the end. We're going to be talking about critical post-traumatic growth. So this presentation is dedicated to the children and young people who love and trust me enough to call me Mama Stacy. Some I birthed and some chose me, but all of them changed my life. And it is with their spirit that I come to you today to talk about how we can create transformative space, starting with ourselves. This presentation is also dedicated to the children and young people who are not with us because of death, incarceration, or exploitation. They deserved a transformative space, and we hope that through this venue, their stories will be heard. I also want to acknowledge this moment, recognizing the deaths of Black cis and trans women and Black men at the hands of the state, and the multicultural uprisings that are occurring in response to this violence. In this crisis, I have been encouraged by so many conversations, some with you all, that have had really bold questions and focusing on courageous action. And so that is the energy that we're going to take into this conversation. We have an opportunity to consider what a transformative space looks like today. And we can examine our little corner of the world, right? And think about what transformation means for us personally and collectively. I am Dr. Staci Ault. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and doctor. And I'm excited to be on this journey with you today. Next slide, please, Roxana. So as we, hopefully you can, you hear some of that sounds, or you can at least see the stream. I want to take a few moments before we start to ground ourselves in our breath. If you like, you can close your eyes or you can watch the images on the screen. And I just want you to just take a moment to notice your breath. Inhale through your nose. Hold. And slowly exhale through your mouth. Notice how your breathing sounds. Give quiet thanks for breath. We are in a moment where our very breath has been attacked on so many levels, and we give thanks for this moment and this opportunity to breathe. Breathe in and breathe out. Notice your thoughts. You don't have to quiet them, just notice them and let them float by. Give yourself permission to be fully present. How is your body? Are you holding tension anywhere? Slowly release that tension and send loving energy to any part of your body that is in pain. I carry tension in my shoulders. So you may want to send loving energy to your shoulders if this is where you carry the weight. Today we're focusing on wellness. We're going to start with our own breaths and our own body. Now imagine your safe space. A place where you go to recharge, to unwind. What does it sound like here? What do you see? Are you by a stream? Are you in the sunshine? Can you feel the droplets of water splashing around your toes? How do you know this place is safe? Use all of your senses. Your sight, in your mind's eye, imagine this space. Your ears, what can you hear? Your feeling, your smell, your touch. Remember this feeling. And now we can slowly come back. Hopefully you're still breathing in, out, and come back to the space. Thank you. Thank you for honoring just a moment to ground ourselves. For many of you, this is your first month of school, right? Some folks were in early August. Some of you just started and you may have had a busy day on Zoom, and Zoom may be the last place you want to be today, right now, right at 3:30. But thank you for grounding yourself and imagining a space that we can create together. Next slide, Roxana. How are you feeling? How are you being? Go ahead and jump in the chat and let me know, was that breathing helpful? Did you fall asleep on me? Hopefully I'll energize you back up in a moment. Let me know in the chat, or let Roxana know in the chat how you're doing. Today, we're going to ground ourselves in healing and wellness. We're going to develop an understanding of critical post-traumatic growth, explore some of the tenets, some deeply, some just an overview. And we're going to consider the implications of post-traumatic growth in our own lives, in our school sites, with our students. And we're going to focus specifically on self-care, specifically on our own wellness. Couple of other logistic pieces. The workbook that accompanies this talk is in Hoover. It's also, it's in Google, so I can send you the link. If anyone doesn't have it, you can raise your hand and let me know, or let Roxana know. But I'll be referencing it a little bit throughout the talk, and then you can take it and use it in small groups, use it as part of your own self-care. An hour is not a very long time to go deeply into these topics, and so wanted to provide you with something that you could take away and really focus on how you can incorporate some of these strategies into your own healing. Next slide, Roxana. So when I think of safe spaces, of transformative space, of wellness, I'm inspired by Dr. Bettina Love, who says, we dream of spaces of love, solidarity, and resilience as we demand what seems impossible from a place of love and of joy. Next slide, Roxana. I'm also inspired by my young people who said, I just need a space where I could be myself, where I don't have to put on a mask and pretend, where I could live and breathe and laugh, where I can be seen and heard without having to yell, where my presence is welcomed, acknowledged, appreciated, and where there is love. Next slide. So many of us this time last year were imagining and reimagining these safe spaces. I did several talks and came together with some of you, and we began to think about, what does a transformative space look like in expanded learning, in our classrooms? Folks started leaning into this work. And then 2020, we were hit by a global pandemic. right? We find ourselves in 3 crises actually at this moment. One seemingly hit us out of nowhere. We watched it creep in from somewhere else in the world. And we were slightly fascinated in, February. What is this COVID-19? Is it going to impact us? And then before we knew it, it was here. The second pandemic has been here so long, we got used to it. We inherited it from the generations before us. And like each generation, we adapted to it. We created task forces to address it. Some of us took our temperatures regularly and followed a list of best practices so we wouldn't pass this pandemic on. Others of us were asymptomatic. Because we weren't taking the proper precautions, we passed it on and didn't even realize it. Some most impacted tried to put on masks to try to avoid it. We came to work or school every day wearing the mask of our success, of respectability politics, of growth, sometimes getting claustrophobic from holding our breath, going home and pulling off our masks, showering to wash the germs off. And of course, I'm talking about the pandemic of 1619. Talking about the pandemic of racism, when the first Africans were brought to this country. I'm talking about the genocide of indigenous folks and the ongoing spaces that are oftentimes created in our schools that don't best serve children that look like us. We're also impacted by wildfires in California, another crisis that literally attempts to take our breath. This was a rallying cry for the summer, I can't breathe. And yet some people now literally, we can't breathe. And so all of these experiences are deadly and destructive, and we're impacted by getting sick ourselves, right? And we're also impacted by watching or discussing this death. We're traumatized by it, but we can't look away. We want to understand the news, but sometimes we're so plugged in that it's hard for us to unplug and focus on our students and focus on ourselves. These pandemics have caused confusion and anxiety as we spent all summer as educators trying to get ready for this moment of what school was going to be like in the fall, oftentimes with being met with confusing messages and fears and anxieties around how can we create a transformative space virtually? How can we create a space that not only honors our students, but also works for ourselves? This pandemic of racism has in the past fallen on the experts, the doctors, the trauma team, right? We've asked equity departments to provide training to solve this pandemic, to fix this problem. All of you here, though, are first responders and essential workers in this fight against this pandemic of racism. School wellness is the perfect place for us to examine our own practices and think about how these traumas are impacting our own lives so that we can create a transformative space for our students. Hopefully, critical post-traumatic growth will offer you a space to do just that. Next slide, Roxana. So with everything that we've talked about, how many of you feel like this? This is my daughter's favorite picture of me, and I'm just like, I cannot anymore. I don't know if I have it in me to create a safe space for my students when I'm barely trying to create a safe space for myself, right? Many of us are also homeschooling our own children. And so those of you who are teachers and administrators, I know you show up every day wanting to be fully present for your students when them other kids whose teacher is also trying to homeschool them is on your last nerve, and you want to suspend them and exclude them from your classroom, but you can't because your classroom is your home. And we laugh about it. My daughter is an 8th grade teacher. She teaches 8th grade math. And, you know, every day I get the updates about, you know, it's noon, is it too early for mimosas? Is it too late to go back to bed, right? Like trying to grapple with the magnitude of this moment. Next slide, Roxana. And many of us, me included, have made light of this time and tried to stay laughing. My students and my colleagues have said in our healing space that one of the things they love to do the most is laugh, because it allows them to kind of take a break from the realities of life. And so even though laughing is one of my healing strategies, I also know that I don't want to minimize the impact of this time. And we know that educators can exhibit trauma symptoms similarly to those of their students. And in fact, during this time, as educators, we too are battling our own trauma. When we experience trauma, we often disconnect. Our bodies do what we have to do to endure, to survive, but the energy from that trauma doesn't go away. It is stored in our bodies to be dealt with later. If we never deal with it, it's inevitably passed on to others, both now and in the future. It is transmitted in classrooms and in relationships. Sometimes, because we feel so out of control by the trauma we're experiencing, we're moved by the need to be in control of something. And sometimes that can be our workplace. And because we're out of control in so many ways, we remember that when we're in our classrooms and we try to control our environments, and this can manifest itself in perfectionism, anxiety, rigidity, and especially now during such a time of confusion, we must recognize these behaviors. If we do not, the very spaces we're trying to create as brave space will become spaces where we exclude those who resist our structure, which of course results in harm, not just for those who we have excluded, but for those who bear witness. So then healing is attending to our current situation and our environment, but it isn't just settling here, it's looking towards our future and reconnecting with our past. When we consider the context of oppression, we recognize colonial powers stripped our ancestors of language and culture. African people in the Americas were punished for using their indigenous languages, for practicing healing. Schooling has also done this. Indigenous Americans were sent to boarding schools and punished also for speaking their languages and expressing themselves culturally. Immigrant children were forced to assimilate in the same ways, either because of policies, practices, or pressures. And so this legacy of trauma is one that continues to manifest itself in our school spaces. And those of us who are educators of color feel its impact every day when we show up and fight against it. And those of us who are white allies also feel its impact when we show up every day and try to fight against these traumas. Next slide, please. And so my own research, right, in the midst of all of this, in 2012, I think, I went back to school to get a doctorate after some trauma in my own life, and began to wonder about this concept of post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is a positive psychological phenomenon that says, even when we've experienced trauma, we can, and many, many people grow, not just in spite of, but sometimes because of the trauma that they've experienced. And some of these ways include the ability to tell a new story and write a new narrative. We rely on others differently when we've experienced trauma and have deeper relationships with others. We have more courageous and honest communication, oftentimes because we have less to lose, because we know what trauma looks like. We've stared fear in the face. We look for the positive. We find ourselves practicing being optimistic and grateful. We find deeper meaning and spirituality in the practices of our ancestors, in the practices of our faith. And we're inspired by renewed creativity because we know that we have to learn new ways to express ourselves. But as I became more aware of post-traumatic growth, I realized much of the research, although encouraging, didn't quite speak to my lived experiences or the experiences of our young people. Research in post-traumatic growth oftentimes shares a lot about singular acts of trauma that shook people to the core and made them question life. You can search through YouTube and find numerous examples of post-traumatic growth among people who've survived plane crashes, accidents, or mass shootings. But youth of color experience trauma differently. They experience what we call persistent and racialized traumatic stress. Next slide, please. We know that racism is so universal in this country, so widespread and deep-seated that it is invisible because it is so normal, but our young people know this. And yet they still navigate not only the community and personal trauma in their lives, but the trauma of sometimes being on school campuses that weren't created for space for students that look like them. Next slide, please. And so in 2017, I conducted a participatory action research project with high school students, 10 Black, cis, and trans girls who called themselves Queen Speak. And they conducted a research project that explored their own experiences of identifying as a girl and being Black on Northern California high school campuses. They conducted interviews and focus groups, and they wrote in their journals and captured their experiences. And I wrote in my journal in observation of their process. And what blew my mind the most about Queen Speak, and frankly, so many of the young people I've worked with, was two things. I was overwhelmed by the collective level of trauma that they had experienced and witnessed, including racialized traumatic stress. And in the midst of this trauma, they were successfully navigating our school systems. They had strength and agency. They were amazingly powerful, strong, empathetic, and filled with faith and hope. They said, when I think about how much I've been through, I realize how strong I am. Another student said, I feel like, we're one of the strongest people because we go through so much and we don't have as much as everybody else has, and yet we've been through so much more, but we still strive through and work hard to get what we have. And that brings us to critical post-traumatic growth. Next slide, please. Which complicates our view of trauma to move beyond things that happen at home or in the community to fully understand racialized spaces, including school as a site of trauma. It challenges us to name the trauma that we collectively experience without glorifying or sensationalizing it, and inspires us to create spaces that propel students and ourselves towards growth. I was reading a research article this morning that was talking about critical post-traumatic growth or post-traumatic growth during COVID, and how so many of us in the midst of this racial uprising of 2020, in the midst of COVID-19 quarantining, have experienced some of the signs of post-traumatic growth in our own lives. And so I'm going to just pause here for a moment. And I want to hear from you, any questions you have so far, or any examples, and Roxana can give us direction how to do this in the chat, but any examples that you personally have found when it comes to post-traumatic growth and opportunities to lean into this experience. And in what ways do you feel like you have grown? What are some bright lights within the midst of this trauma that you have experienced? And I'll pause. I'm actually going to grab my computer charger. And Roxana, if you could just tell us the best way to now engage as we have this conversation.
Yes, definitely. So you should all be viewing through our Hooba platform. We do have a section on the side that is for chat. I see a lot of you have already started adding to that, which is some comments that were given at the beginning after the great exercise that Dr. Ault gave. I'll just kind of share some comments that were noted by some of our participants already. Philip said that it was lovely. Thank you. Mariah mentioned that it was nice. We have Rebecca also sharing that she felt refreshed after participating in that. So that was really great. And I'm hopeful everyone was able to hear the sounds on your end as well. I also see some comments coming in about the handout, and they love it. And thank you for sharing. And so that handout is that Dr. Ault has mentioned is available. If you scroll down the webinar section, it's under handouts. But we encourage you to put your questions as throughout the presentation in the chat or the Q&A section. And we'll be monitoring this along the way. But as Dr. Ault mentioned, she really wants to hear from you. What are your thoughts so far? Things that will come to mind just from what we've heard. So I'll just give everyone a moment just to kind of collect your thoughts, maybe type something in.
I'm really interested in what ways have you seen post-traumatic growth in your own lives during this season? And Tom says, I am not seeing the chat of others. You need to click the top tab section above this that says chat. I'm looking for it, Tom.
Yeah, so there's a session Q&A tab and then the chat. So make sure you just hover over to the other side. Oh, I see that you got it, Tom. Great. So that is a space. We encourage you just type away. I see some folks are typing. So we'll just give it a few moments. Hopefully someone has a question or two, we can really start this discussion.
And I'll let me know, Roxana, when we can move on. Why don't I tell you a little bit more about critical post-traumatic growth, and then Roxana, you can let me know if we have any questions in the chat or ways that people are experiencing post-traumatic growth during this time.
Yes, so I got one from Crystal. I saw that Crystal was also typing away during this. So Crystal shared that an experience with CPS created an opportunity to serve on the Children's Coalition and CPS Oversight Committee to make meaningful systemic and policy changes.
Hi, Crystal. Hi, Boo. Yes, so opportunities are opening. People are leaning into conversations and thinking more about how we can connect intentionally with community. And it sounds like community members are taking advantage of those opportunities and making sure that there's representation. We're going to talk a little bit more about representation in a moment when we talk about identity. Thank you. So critical post-traumatic growth is nothing new. These discoveries aren't revolutionary. Rather, they're conversations that have been had around the dinner table, over tea, over the phone. We recognize the power of so many of us as we navigate the differing areas of our lives, right? And some of you, I know my own daughters have watched me go through some traumatic experiences in my own life, and they too have battled trauma. I have 5 daughters and a son. And so when I talk about the kids that call me Mama Stacy, some of them belong to me by birth, some are my students, but all of them, I've watched them navigate sometimes undescribable experiences with different types of trauma, and yet they show up, they lean in, they have so much agency and personality and excitement about life. And sometimes it's survival, right? Our people have survived. We are a testament of their resilience. It is time for us to reclaim those narratives of strength and power that have been left out of the history books, and even reclaim the word strong when it has often been weaponized against us. In my work with Black female students, Black femmes, cis and trans Black girls, they talked about how Black superwoman was both a positive and a negative stereotype in their lives. And in some ways, Black and brown women and sometimes women in general are seen as strong, and they have the ability to keep going. And so we reclaim that strength in this conceptual framework, and we lean into the fact that we have this ability to be strong, and we recognize that we don't always have to be, right? That we get to also focus on our own wellness in the midst of this trauma. Critical post-traumatic growth pulls from both post-traumatic growth and critical race theory. And critical race theory asserts that race, as we currently know it, is socially constructed, and racism and white supremacy are the foundations for all of our institutions. In other words, we must be actively anti-racist in our practice in order to create change. Critical race theory also maintains a commitment to social justice and to challenging the dominant narrative, and for making room for diverse stories, for centering, in fact, counter narratives that challenge what we've been taught about youth and communities of color, about trauma, and about growth. Some years ago, when we started kind of implementing a trauma-informed framework, many of us thought deeply about the spaces that we created and began to, in some ways, imagine our children as only recipients of trauma, right? Instead of realizing that they had a full complexity. And while we recognize that trauma can be debilitating in many ways, and that we have to dismantle these systems that cause trauma, we also have to realize that we have power, and our students have power and agency. It turns out critical post-traumatic growth was happening all around me. Next slide, please. And in schools, it's often easiest to focus on individual student engagement practices or explicit instructions about behaviors, but it's daunting to examine the context within which we are living. And so if we can focus on these 4 areas, we know that they have an impact on how well we can grow from our trauma. And so as we're thinking about creating transformative spaces, we have to maintain a focus on optimism. Dr. Barbara Fredrickson talks about positivity, and optimism is a part of that. And she talks about needing to have a 4-to-1 ratio of positive to negative experiences or thoughts just to break even. As recipients of trauma, as human beings, we're wired to fight, flight, freeze. We're wired to go into survival mode when we've experienced trauma. And so us being intentionally positive and optimistic about being able to, and leaning into the dismantling of oppressive spaces, allows us to maximize our growth. We also want to be thinking about control, both for ourselves and our students. As I talked about earlier, when we feel like we don't have control, a lot of times that's when we grasp onto the little control that we have. And for students, this can mean acting up. I was that student. I dropped out of high school when I got pregnant at 17. Actually, I didn't drop out, like I walked out full of, strength in deciding that this space wasn't for me and that I was gonna, make my way differently. And so I needed control over that decision for myself, and how many more of our students, because of the environment, take control by deciding to resist these environments. We also are going to talk a little bit about coping styles and how we navigate, as well as a sense of self. Next slide, please. So here are the tenets of critical post-traumatic growth. In order to examine and transform the spaces within which we navigate, we've got to first recognize the current context. We also have to name the suffering. I have amended a lot of my conversation, not a lot of my training in the last, I would say 3-6 months, to not uplift examples of specific trauma that myself or my students have experienced, because many of us felt like we were nothing more than a trauma story. And so while it's okay not to name and constantly feel like we have to name the trauma, we also need to lean in and recognize the suffering, the interpersonal, community, and structural suffering we experience. We're going to do some of this together. We have found through research that identity plays a huge role in how we navigate trauma and growth, how our identities are recognized and uplifted in spaces. And then number 4, community. Community is a core tenet of any critical theory. It's what connects us to strength and support beyond our immediate circle. And it is the sphere of community that young people of color, young women especially, expressed the most growth. Next slide, please. Navigation. We have to learn to navigate systems in different ways, and the workbook is actually an entire exercise in navigating your own healing and the own process that you have of wellness. Resistance. Critical theories encourage us to move beyond resilience, to consider how people of color, students of color, ourselves resist oppression and silencing. Number 7, voice. We already talked about storytelling and narrative, and they're such an important part of the healing process in many cultures. Conversely, trauma often thrives in places where voices are silenced or invisible. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, hope and love, and rooting our practices in love. And this workbook is really a testament to self-love and self-compassion and the hopefulness that we find within ourselves as we navigate through this moment. Next slide, please. So I'm hoping that you can see this in your Zoom, and I want us to think now from the context of self. And I want us to take a moment to think about our own experiences. And we learned how the trauma of our students can impact the trauma of educators, whether it's through compassion fatigue or secondary traumatic stress. And in this moment, we're navigating our very real trauma, our own traumas. And so these slides have 4 areas this slide has 4 areas that focuses on the ways that we carry trauma. We can carry trauma emotionally. And here are some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or persistent traumatic stress that we may be feeling even right now. I know myself, insomnia and difficulty sleeping has been a huge part of navigating this season since school started, really. I've had a lack of confidence about my own ability to navigate virtual spaces. And that's weighed on me and has been a trauma symptom. Sometimes our trauma symptoms could be mental. They could include a loss of concentration, memory loss, distractibility. We can blame our distractibility on working from home. But for many of us during this moment, distractibility is also a trauma symptom related to this moment. So when you find yourself doing dishes in your break, when you probably should be unplugging and resting, that could in fact be a symptom of trauma. Sometimes we carry our trauma behaviorally, and this can be withdrawing from others. It could be aggression, anger, arguing with loved ones, increased sleeping, changes in appetite, increased drug or alcohol use. All of these things are things that young people too have shared with me during this season that have been ways that they've chosen to cope with these trauma symptoms. And then finally, we carry our trauma in our body. Researchers say sometimes we can carry the traumas for generations. Indigenous scholars say 7 generations can carry trauma in our body. And so the more healing that we do now in terms of our own bodies, the less likely we will be to pass on this trauma to future generations. Some of the physical symptoms could be aches and pains, fatigue and tiredness, racing heart, shakiness or trembling, headaches, hot flashes. All of these things could be symptoms of trauma. And so there's a place in your workbook that you can think about what that looks like for you. If you're comfortable and want to share with others, you can use us as your squad and your accountability group to just name, where are we? And now we can move into, once we know where we are, we can examine some ways of transforming that trauma into triumph or into growth. Next slide, please. Identity is a huge, our young people found that identity was had a huge impact on their growth. And so thinking about all of the intersectional identities and how their identities were represented in their expanded learning spaces, in their classrooms, impacted how they either wore the mask or were able to show up in their authentic self. And so we want to think about identity through an intersectional lens or a lens of intersectionality. The impact of racism or racial oppression is not fully realized without interrogating the intersections of all forms of oppression: race, class, gender, sexuality, immigration status, ability, age, etc. The frame requires an exploration and analysis of how other forms of oppression are intertwined with and complicated by racial oppression. So if we're thinking about this moment, those of us who navigate oppression and privilege differently or in different ways based on our intersectional identities, it could directly impact how traumatized we feel or how all of these areas of our identity are impacted by this trauma. I'm doing a presentation tomorrow night on a podcast about privilege. And I've been thinking a lot about class privilege, especially within the Black community, and about how the privilege that I have to have a home, to be able to have a job that I can work from that home, right, has impacted my growth during this time. I get to take walks with my 15-year-old, and it's one of the ways that we've grown. And let me tell you, she would not walk with me 6 months ago, take a walk, with my mama on a street. Absolutely not. And so one of the ways that I've recognized my privilege has been in the ability to navigate my surroundings differently because of my class. Age, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, language, ability, all of these things provide us a lens within which to examine privilege and oppression. And all of these things we must take into consideration when we're thinking about our own wellness. Conversely, my racial identity and my gender identity as a Black woman has caused me to hold a lot of trauma through the summer and through this racial uprising as the names of Black women have been silenced and dismissed in a lot of our conversations, right? And so me recognizing that and knowing that I need to unplug from social media and I need to surround myself with my squad in order to navigate that trauma because it impacts me differently, directly. Next slide, please. And so there are some healing exercises that we can do specifically related to identity. And this is found in the workbook on pages 18 to 20. But some of the questions that we can ask ourselves either in journaling is an amazing way to process. It is one of the ways that you can see like my journal, carry it everywhere. It's one of the ways that I process through what I'm experiencing and one of the ways that I heal. And some of the journaling prompts you could also use in small groups. And so if you have your squad, or we'll talk a little bit later about a wellness circle on your campus. So if you have a space where you can answer some of these questions collectively, it can also help you process. And some of the questions, self-care questions you can ask directly related to identity are: who are your ancestors and how did they heal? How does identity show up in your self-care plan? How are you thinking about your own intersections and your own ways of navigating the world? The things that you love, how do they show up in your self-care plan? What works for you in self-care may not be the same that works for someone else because of your unique identity. And what does this look like in our classrooms? Sometimes our identities are shrouded in a legacy of fear. And we carry this legacy on by being hard on ourselves. How can you be more compassionate with yourself when you are afraid? All of these things are ways that we can lean into thinking about using our own specific identities in our healing. I'm sitting right now in a healing space on 24th and Florin where young people come and engage in their own healing. And one of the ways that we represent identities, I think you can see the artwork on my wall, but it's women with afros doing yoga and meditation and Kemetic yoga so that they can see themselves in the healing of their ancestors as well. Next slide, please. We must also prioritize community. The young people that I work with found that community building was one of the ways that they were able to grow from their trauma when they were able to share their experiences with other people who had had similar experiences to them. Dr. Melissa Harris Perry coined the term squad care, which I think speaks to a relationship building that happens in community. And she writes, "What lifted me up from the floor, unlocked the front door, helped me find a counselor, and initiated 20 years of bullshit-free friendship was not self-care, it was squad care." And so I ask you, as you're thinking about your healing, who is your squad? How are you being intentional in spending time with those that are a part of your squad? How does your squad show up and encourage you? And how does your squad hold you accountable to your self-care and your healing? These characteristics, the ability to encourage and hold you accountable, may show up in one person, or you may need multiple versions or multiple members of a squad at different times. I have friends that I know are my cheerleaders, and as part of my self-care, I'll text or reach in, or if I'm experiencing some battles, I'll be really intentional about building in self-care with my cheerleaders and my encouragers. And sometimes I need those people who hold me accountable and ask me how I'm doing and listen, who remind me to drink water and breathe and pee and eat and exercise. I want you to think about, and your workbook has some places to think about how you can engage your community in your healing. Next slide, please. Trauma thrives in silencing. And in your workbook in pages 23 and 24, you'll have opportunities to think about how do you use your voice as a healing modality. Storytelling is a form of healing. Telling stories during this moment has been uplifting for many. Today, these stories are told through short captions on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook. They're accompanied with pictures, but our ancestors also told stories without technology, sharing legends and myths and realities from generation to generation. Both are affirming. Social justice is also an important facet of self-care that we ignore, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But when we think about voice, we don't just think about the words that come out of our mouth or the words that come out on paper, but we also think about all the other creative ways that we express ourselves. My young people found healing in dancing, in poetry, in art, in photography, in music, in making beats, in making songs. So I want you, and in this workbook, there's a way for you to think about what is a way that you use your voice and how can that directly be related to your healing? And then, of course, how can we use those same skills and abilities to engage with our young people in the way that we create transformative spaces in our classrooms? In what ways do our classrooms become a venue of voice? And how are we using even these electronic breakout sessions and different ways where young people can creatively share their voices? Next slide, please. As I mentioned, social justice is also an important facet of self-care that oftentimes we ignore. And by joining resistance efforts for racial justice, gender justice, climate justice, or other forms of resistance, you can sometimes see your own trauma in a different light. I went back to school after trauma in my own life. And part of that process involved me doing some volunteer work with girls in juvenile hall. And I realized that I was engaging with these young women who had experienced sexual exploitation. I saw my own trauma in a different light. And I saw how intentionally our liberation was tied up together. Especially for teachers and educators of color, rest and joy is also resistance. Centering your own well-being in a society that has historically used your labor is a form of self-care. As Audre Lorde says, it is political warfare. One of my favorite Instagram homes is the nap ministry that says it shouldn't be radical to rest, but after centuries of living under and participating in capitalism and white supremacy, here we are. We can disrupt and resist. Let us nap. Refusal is also self-care. Saying no to things that get added to your plate and prioritizing this urgent work of healing is self-care. Some of the ways white supremacy can show up in our workspaces is through perfectionism, productivity, and the maintaining of power. So resistance and allowing us to take time off or not be perfect, especially during this time. I have a 15-year-old who's a 10th grader, and she talks so much shit about everybody. But some of the folks she talks about are her teachers. And I tell her, remind her, right? Give grace. We're old, we grown. We're trying to figure out this virtual and distance learning environment. And being honest and transparent with your students can be resistance. Sharing your fears and anxieties about this moment can be resistance, especially in spaces where we're told that we're supposed to separate our personal lives from our school lives. And yet now here we are, we find ourselves in our homes having school. If you are not a person of color, if you are white, you can resist in other ways. As I mentioned, social justice spaces and social justice actions are also a form of self-care and can increase your happiness hormones. Next slide, please. And so as we wind down, I want us to think about those areas of critical post-traumatic growth that the young people and research have identified as being pivotal in allowing us to grow. Thinking about identity, thinking about community, thinking about resistance, thinking about voice. And we're gonna pull it all together. And I want you to think about your own self-care plan. So you can find this table in your workbook, but I want to take a minute for us to just have a conversation about this. And if you notice, this is the same table that you saw in the beginning, where we had all of the symptoms. And so if you were paying attention at that time, you may have circled some if you printed a workbook, or you may have jotted in your notes some areas that you felt like you were struggling with. And so now we have an opportunity to think about these same areas and reimagine some ways of healing together using this framework. And so as we do this, you may notice that I added an area called organizational. And so you can, I'm gonna shut up in a minute. And as we come to a close, I wanna really have a conversation about these different ways of healing, and whether we're in the chat, and I don't even know if we have the ability to unmute ourselves, but I'm really interested in either you asking questions about these specific areas or tools of healing, or sharing with each other some strategies depending on which column we fell in. And you may not have felt in any of those columns, right? Your greatest source of stress might be your workplace or the organizational experiences that you're having right now. And so there's some suggestions for things that we can do organizationally as well to inspire healing. And so Roxana, what's the best way for us to jump into this question and answer? Can we do that verbally, or should we do that in the chat? And let's talk about healing and what this looks like for us. And if you like, for our students as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ault. So I just got word that the way that we have the the webinar function right now, it doesn't allow folks to be able to unmute themselves, but I do have some questions that did kind of trickle in a little bit ago. If that's all right, I can just share those, and others, I see that, feel free to add in through the Zoom chat or the Kahoot chat. We have both open and we're moderating those accordingly. So I just want to share some comments that came in a little bit early on. There was one from Crystal. She shared that sometimes it feels like the system can create a bit of chaos during crisis, and this makes folks feel powerless, empty, and exhausted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Crystal. And that's one of the reasons why I added this column of organizational wellness, right? What can we do collectively to push back against some of those systemic structures, and as well as create a space where we're being intentional about healing justice? Because we can't do this work we can't do justice work, and every educator, as far as I'm concerned, should be interested in educational justice, and we can't do justice work without focusing on healing. And we will not really have healing until we also focus on justice, because what we'll do is we'll unplug for a moment, we'll go do some self-care, and then we'll come back to the very same system that is causing the toxicity in the first place. And so creating squads at work, having community mobilization, being really honest and transparent as a community member, especially to support those leaders and those folks that are inside of the institutions. That squad care can be really huge. I know in the work that we did at Sac City Unified, I could not have done any of that work when we talked about creating transformational spaces without being in lock and step with my youth and community. And oftentimes my role as a leader was to stand behind them as they brought forth the change, and how healing that was for me to be able to create a space where they had agency and power, and how healing it was for them to also be able to speak truth to power. So thank you, Crystal, for that. That's facts.
Thank you, Crystal, for sharing. We also had another question from Rochelle, who's curious on if you would touch on how the brain works differently for children who have experienced trauma and how that affects their ability to learn new information.
Absolutely. And so we know, right, that trauma leaves an imprint inside of our brain. And one of the ways that this manifests itself is through fight, flight, and freeze. And so our brains are hardwired that when we experience trauma, we go into what some researchers call the lizard brain, right? It's a survival brain. And you may have found this even in this trauma of COVID-19, that your higher order thinking and your ability to process information has often been compromised. I know mine has, because I've been in survival mode. And so that lizard brain moves to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And fight is when a child has experienced trauma and feels as though they have to fight their way through everything. And so for my students that I worked with, that I continue to work with, a lot of them feel like the fight of just showing up at school leaves them so depleted that they don't have the energy to then engage in additional trauma on their school campuses. Another way that trauma impacts our brain is through flight, right? Like we escape. And you'll see this especially among young people in drug or alcohol use, in not showing up to school. I think we're seeing it especially now during distance learning, where we want to withdraw ourselves from the sources of our trauma. We also sometimes freeze, and we know that freezing is that we're afraid, and our brains are literally, when we're afraid and we're frozen, our brains literally cannot learn. And so what happens is we're providing all of these lessons and all of this information to our students, but unless we're specifically creating a space where they feel safe, they're not able to absorb the information because they're stuck in that trauma symptom of freeze. And then finally, new researchers talk about fawn. And this is really helpful, I think, when we're thinking about especially high-performing students, and we miss their trauma symptoms because the way that they manifest their way that they cope with their trauma is by being an amazing student. Fawning is sort of describes leaning into adults and being, sometimes we could call it trauma bonding, and allowing people to mistreat us because we don't want to fight, flight, or freeze anymore. And so we find this among high performing students when we don't have spaces where they can where their identities are represented, or we don't have spaces where they can find community with us and with others. They smile and nod, and we don't even realize the depths of trauma that they're experiencing because on the surface, they're fawning. So it looks like they're doing well and they're being successful because they are obedient, because they are quieter, because they are a little more passive. The young people that I worked with talked about Miss Stacy, and I'm not going to get the quote correct completely, but something to the effect of, we're invisibilized in our school and we're silenced until we pop off. And so they talked about how many of them were used fawn and tried to be that quiet, compliant student. And then when it got too much was when they expressed themselves in anger, right? And so either way, the students aren't able to learn. And those symptoms are similar. And remember, our brains don't stop, similar to adults in terms of the things that I mentioned earlier in the symptoms of trauma. And remember that students' brains don't stop developing until they're 25. And so all of these traumas that they're experiencing are leaving an impact on the brain. But what we also know about children's brains is they're super malleable and they're little sponges. And especially during adolescence, if we can recreate spaces where they're finding themselves affirmed, it literally rewrites their trauma imprint and will increase their not only ability to learn, but the impact of trauma as they move through life. Relationships is one of those ways. Creating safe spaces and having affirming relationships with others is one of the things that literally rewrites the brain imprint.
Thank you. We have another question that, has a great transition from what you're just talking about from Tani, asking if you can speak a little more about generational trauma and how that's passed on.
Yes, so there, there's a lot of scholars that are really leaning into this concept of generational trauma. And Indigenous scholars will say that generational trauma can last for 7 years throughout our lives, throughout 7 generations, of people can carry this trauma imprint. Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is just one example of generational trauma. And she talks about how the traumas are passed on both physically, right? The body keeps score, or socially. And so when we've experienced trauma, this impacts our parenting, this impacts the way that we navigate the world. And so Joy DeGruy gives the example of being in a bank and standing in line. Joy DeGruy is a Black doctor, Black professor, Black researcher. She's actually local, amazing scholar who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And she describes being in the line at a bank with her daughter. And she describes watching a white woman with her daughter, just a few people up as they were lined up in the bank, back when we could line up in banks before 2020. And she describes watching the white little girl who was the same age as her Black daughter running around the bank, and she ran over and she looked at the coffee and she smelt it, and she began playing with the little slips that they have where you could make deposits, and she climbed over the barriers that were in between the hold, you know, allowing you to show where you lined up. And Joy remembers giving the side eye to her daughter, like, you know better, you better not. And she describes how we laugh about that in communities of color, and about how, you know, we have our kids on our hip and you better not move and you better be obedient in front of these folks. Especially, we'll say, you better not act up in front of these white folks. And that's said in communities of color. And she talks about how generationally, though, that's tied to chattel slavery and tied to what happened to disobedient children. What happened to children that stood out in the crowd is they literally could be taken and sold from their parents and or physically punished. And so many Black folks, in terms of their parenting, used strategies to keep their children in line for their very survival. And that is passed on from generation to generation and shows up in our own parenting. Dr. Staci Patton is also an amazing researcher who talks about how generational trauma is passed on in our parenting. So check out both of those. If you need those, I can figure out how to get in the chat and let you know. But both of those books, Spare the Kids and Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, talk about generational trauma in the Black community and how we still pass on some of those myths around the way that we're supposed to physically discipline our children and the way that we're supposed to keep our children in line are in fact generational responses to trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Ault. We have another question from Rebecca asking, how can we promote self-care practices to younger students right now?
Yes, so the little mindfulness exercises, the exercise that we did in our classroom can be done in your Zooms. You can do mindfulness and meditation practices as part of your social emotional learning time. I have, my grandbaby is 4 and she'll sit her little butt down and do some yoga. So you can teach them how to dance or how to have a yoga break. In my classes with college students, if I'm on Zoom too long, we'll do a dance break. And my students are like, oh my gosh, Dr. Ault, could you not? Because I, you know, the myth about all Black people knowing how to dance is not necessarily true. And so I don't care. It helps me move my body and it's self-care for me. But little ones can use these self-care practices as well. There is also breathing. We can teach our young people how to breathe. And there's an educator out of the Bay Area, and I cannot remember his name. I hope that it comes to me before I'm done. But he teaches elementary students how to breathe, and he teaches them how to do warrior breath. And so warrior breath, he says, take a big, deep breath. And that's a warrior breath. And so you can think about different ways of teaching even little ones how to breathe. And all of those things can be done with preschoolers, elementary school students. And I recommend building them into your classroom time. Build them into your social emotional learning time. Be really intentional about that and teach the children, I use young people because I work mainly with adolescents, but teach the little ones that you can do these practices when you feel stressed out at home, right? And you can meditate. And so you can also share in your Google Classroom. Coloring exercises can be a great way of doing mindfulness and reinforcing self-care activities for little ones, but you can put all of those things in your Google Classroom. You can talk to the parents about Mindful Minute. And, you know, mindfulness, AKA, used to be like AKA timeout. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about that minute that I just need a break from you. I need you to go to timeout, right? We're talking about a minute that we can take together, parents and children, that we can breathe and regain our energy and think about wellness. And you'll be surprised how kids will turn that back on you. My grandbaby, I guarantee you, will turn around with a, "Ooh, Nani, I think you need a mindful minute." So know that it could backfire, but we can incorporate, especially during social emotional learning. I think that's a great way to think about the how we can incorporate self-care.
Thank you. I also just want to share some more comments that are trickling through. So Tom shared that he loves how Sac City Unified's unwavering commitment to student wellness is impacted in this way. Their policy for safe haven was announced in his classroom, and he gets it. They take great care with these conversations in class, and they have them often at Burbank High School.
Hi, Tom. Yes, and knowing that when we talk about identity and representation, right, safe haven is huge when we're thinking about our immigrant students and how we find safety in our classrooms. And so allowing spaces where identity is celebrated and we can hold space for even difficult conversations about race and identity can be self-care for young people. I think too, and I know, Tom, I think you teach photography. And so even sharing our own skills, right, and the own ways that we engage in our healing can be, you know, whether it's part of our own curriculum or not, can be just another way that we teach our young people how important it is for them to take care of themselves. And they may not know what they love at this point. There's a space in the journal where I share that when I first went through a divorce in 2010, I had to make a list of 10 things I like because I didn't even remember who I was. And I think that parenting during COVID sometimes has us forgetting who even am I? What do I even enjoy to do when work and home blends all together and I'm feeling all this trauma? And so young people don't necessarily know what they like. Right? And so us exposing them to different things and allowing them to do things like forest bathing and let's take a walk outside, or positivity practices, or photography can be another great way of bridging kind of that gap between classroom and self-care and healing.
Thank you. I also see that Crystal has a comment and then a question at the bottom. She shares that CPS and the penal system mirrors some of those policy and practices affecting children and families, early implementation, and incorporating that into norms. Wellness practices should definitely be included within the curriculum and environment and school climate. And then there is a follow-up question. She says, from Tom, Dr. Ault, do you believe, as I do, that we need to teach hope explicitly or to instill hope?
Yeah, so even as we close this talk, right, I think one of the most important aspects of critical post-traumatic growth is that focus on hope and love, right? Like we can't do this work without being mindful of hope. And I think about the work that I've done with young people, and especially during this time of racial uncertainty, one of the first things for us to go when we don't find a place for ourselves is our hope, right? And so explicitly having conversations about hopefulness. Jeff Duncan Andrade has an amazing article called Roses in Concrete, or The Rose That Grows in Concrete. And he talks about the different kinds of hope. And he says it can't be hokey hope, right? Like we can't have kind of hokey surface level conversations about hope and just be hopeful, right? But we have to have audacious hope. We have to have the type of hope that allows us to name these inequities and join hands in dismantling them. And that kind of hope, as we show up for our students inside of school spaces and outside of school spaces, is what really allows our students to know that they feel loved. Duncan Andrade also talks about harmony as opposed to balance between those of us that are hope-filled educators and hope dealers, right? And Duncan Andrade talks about, he says that for him, balance, you know, thinking that I'm going to somehow leave my work at work and then go home is a very westernized and linear view of engagement. And if you really want to think about hope and love in the classroom, you want to think more about this concept of harmony, where, like jazz, all of the aspects of my life fit together and they're integrated, whether it's the hook or the riff or the beats. And I'm not a musician, so I may have got the names wrong, but if you listen to jazz or reggae or anything really in your headphones, you can hear all of these different parts of a harmony, right? And all of them fit together. And so how do we think about incorporating our classroom spaces inside and outside of school and our relationships with students in this way that allows for that to be harmonious? For me, what that looks like is we opened up a space on 24th and Florin. It's a healing space for Black youth. Any of you who are social distancing or need a place to heal and want to come by, hit me up. I got you. But allowing students from Burbank, Tom, to come down and find harmony and find spaces where we're igniting their hope, right? And sometimes that's really practical. So sometimes we talk about healing and mental health and our young people are hungry, right? So we've got to think about meeting basic needs as well. As I've traveled the country and gone into different classrooms of folks, I've seen, and even during COVID, I've seen hope-filled educators with cabinets full of groceries, right? That kids can come if they need to eat in the classroom. That's where they can, you know, that we know that we're going to make sure they eat. During COVID, teachers have done drive-bys and dropped off basic necessities for young people. And so I think that as we think about audacious hope, we also think about how are we meeting those, you know, very real needs that our young people have.
We also have a comment or a quote that Tani shared in the chat. Hate is too heavy, a burden to bear. Love is a better way by John Lewis. And Tom also shared, agreeing with what you were saying, a fine thing, response to your last dialogue. I really encourage everyone to continue asking questions. We still have half an hour set aside from Q&A, and Dr. Ault can continue talking about other points, that elaborating on things that she might have talked about or things that might have stemmed from this discussion that you'd love to learn more about. I'll start with the question that I had. If you are able to maybe share an example of how you've really talked about this trauma-informed framework, and so I'm curious as to like an example of how to incorporate this into a space, whether it was your previous position or what you are doing currently, and maybe it can help the group really kind of visualize what that would look like.
Absolutely. So I'll talk about both a space within a school setting, and then I'll talk about a community space as well. And one of the things that I would say is that critical post-traumatic growth, right, or trauma-informed work, hopefulness, all of these kind of names for this very similar type of building deep relationships and authenticity with our young people is just a framework. There isn't like 5 steps that you can take to have an anti-racist environment, right? Or oftentimes we want, like, tell me exactly what I need to do. First thing we need to do is really examine the context and listen to our young people, our children, our parents. And that's, I think, where that contextual piece in terms of this framework really started. And so I think about, I'm doing a research project currently with some young people who are exploring, it's a youth participatory digital research project. And so they're exploring youth activism among Black youth in Sacramento, a history of youth activism among Black youth in Sacramento. And some of these youth were a part of Men's Leadership Academy at Sac City Unified. Some of the youth were a part of Blacks Making a Difference at it's Sacramento City Unified Schools, and then some were a part of Source Media. And all three of those organizations within the school setting in expanded learning spaces or school day have, whether with intention or not, used those tenets of critical post-traumatic growth to ensure that they had a transformative space for their students. And so it starts with examining the context. And so for MLA, for example, the amazing professors that do Men's Leadership Academy work started with thinking about what is this context that we're examining on our campus. They held youth participatory action research projects where youth could speak specifically, what does this look like? What does my life look like on this campus? My own research looks at allowing spaces for students to think about, what does this campus experience look like for me? That's the context. While we're looking at data, quantitative data, we also want to talk to young people and hear specifically about their experiences. Whether we're holding a healing circle or a listening circle is probably more appropriate name for it, where young people have a space to really name their context. Then, we want to examine the suffering, and most importantly, the suffering that we as schools could attribute to our students. And so in all of those examples I gave, Source Media, MLA, and BMAD, they were really, really focused on, how do we meet you where you are? How do we provide a space for you to name your suffering and where you can be comfortable and authentic in speaking about your truth, and then get you connected to resources if you need them. Because it's hard for young people to engage, like we know, in learning when I'm suffering inside or outside of the classroom. All three of those spaces uplifted identity. So they were really intentional about bringing in people that looked like them to the classroom space. If you are not the same ethnicity as your students, which of course, we have one of the most diverse cities in the country, right? So we are all never going to be likely the same ethnic identity or racial identity as our students. And so how are we bridging that within classroom spaces, making sure that our curriculum uplifts identity? I use that 1-to-4 ratio that Barbara Fredrickson talks about, and I encourage educators in MLA, Source Media, and BMAD do this, right? They're making sure that anything they share comes from the community where the young people live, right? That it's represented, that the curriculum is representative of identities where youth can see themselves. They build community. And so whether that's in classroom spaces or outside of the classroom, there are community norms that govern how we interact. They check on each other outside of school time spaces. They build authentic community among the adults and the children, and they allow the children to create community among each other. A lot of times this can include rituals and resources, or rituals and routines that they do every time they come back together. And you'll see this in some spaces where we always will start with a check-in, or we'll always start with an affirmation. All of those things are community building. Then they think about, what is the best way for us to uplift voice? And I think all three of those examples uplift voice in unique ways. Source Media, for example, puts the mic literally in the hands of the teenagers and allows them to be at the forefront of telling their stories in a way that impacts their environment. And Men's Leadership, Women's Leadership Academy, and BMAD also does the same thing. I remember going to Burbank many years ago when I was still at Sac City Unified School District, and the young people held a forum called Educating the Educators. And the teachers came and listened to young people sharing their truth about their experiences and giving them ideas about how they could be better engaged with them. And that takes courageous leadership to create those types of spaces, but it also allows young people to have voice. And then resistance. One of the things we have to realize is, once you start mobilizing young people, expect collective resistance and support that. I remember we did some youth action research projects at Sac City Unified School District, and I got in trouble and called into a supervisor's office, and the supervisor said, Stacy, your students are going rogue. I need you to get them together. And so I had to like take a deep breath and say, right, you asked me, I'm youth development director. We're creating space for youth voice. We can't all of a sudden squelch the voice when the voice is telling us shit we don't want to hear, right? And so realizing that, you know, allowing space for collective resistance allows us not only to have student growth, but it allows us growth as well. And then you'll see, you know, whether it's ethnic studies, whether it's restorative practices, whether it's wellness spaces, young people know what they need, especially if they're given the exposure to examine things that they may not be currently experiencing, right? And given the place to really expand their radical imagination, young people can come up with ideas for what they need. There's also, I was thinking of a Malcolm X quote that I wrote down, I think just this morning, but I probably won't find it. Of course I won't. But if I do, I'll share it before we go. Let me see. Where are you, Malcolm? Okay, I'll come back to it. But and then thinking about how we navigate, right? So navigation and providing actual infrastructures. And I think Crystal talked about this in terms of the work that she's doing with child protection. Tom talked about this in terms of the wellness spaces. We can't, like, these things can happen in isolated classrooms, but really should be built into the infrastructure of how we do business. And that's that navigation piece and being really intentional about supporting. When young people ask for something, one of the worst things we can do is, you know, if it's a no, it's a no. But if there's a way for us to help support the things that they're asking for and we don't do it, that can set us eons back. Or when we make promises that we don't keep, right? That's that thinking about that navigation. And then of course, staying rooted in hope and love. If you don't take anything else from this talk, I love my students. I tell them I love them unapologetically. And I wasn't always like that. I'm a social work professor. And so I was raised in an era where as social workers, there was a separation between your personal life and your personal emotions and your students. And, you know, I'm dating myself a little bit. We've done some work on that lately, but we were told you leave yourself in the car, right? When you go to this person's house or when you go to this job site, you leave yourself in the car. And I found myself pushing back on that and realizing, no, I bring my full self into this work and I love my students. And that means I have to even more so take care of my own trauma and healing, because then I am going to be hurt at times and experience compassion fatigue and secondary trauma because I love you so very much. The things that you experience impact me greatly, right? But when I take chances and do that and have my own squad and my own self-care, I think that's when the transformation happens.
Thank you. I see there are some comments that have came up. We have one from Bruno, and he says, shout out to Dr. Ault for always keeping it real and not simply talking about theory. Much love and respect always.
Bruno, hey, my friend. All my friends are here. I didn't like tell them to come, though, by the way. They came all on their own. I didn't threaten anyone. This is all love.
Yeah, well, we appreciate everyone being on. I mean, and there's a reason everyone's here. You know, this topic is super interesting. You know, we're getting a lot of other comments coming in. Tom also shared, I applaud the efforts of Jody S. Johnson and BMAT and Jody's ground level approach to student wellness, something that you touched on above. Crystal just shared that students can feel the love and concern and investment. She saw that you were the preserver in the topics and the topics had to attend. I also see that Rochelle shared that you've made a lot of great points on bringing your full self and not holding back on that love. She experiences the same as a social worker in the past.
And that's and I will again say that love, love costs us something, right? Transformation costs us something. If it was going to be easy and we could transform our society without sacrifice, we would have all done it a long time ago. So we have to remember that because it's going to cost us something, we also have to take care of ourselves as we make those sacrifices. Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? Like sometimes we got to take that power. We've got to reclaim that power. But when we do, we put ourselves at risk. We can be ostracized by our colleagues who would rather just, you know, not have that wellness stuff that I gotta be doing. don't add anything else on my plate, right? And so we recognize that and we know how difficult this work can be. And so that self-care and squad care is really, really important in terms of, we're gonna make the sacrifice to create transformative spaces. We wanna make that sacrifice to create transformative spaces and support each other in that work. And sometimes that means, you know, promoting. Sometimes that means leaving environments if they're not for us. Sometimes that means creating community spaces where that can balance the work that's happening in schools, and knowing that, you know, transformation is a community project. It's not something like I'm not the, if I'm the only person that my students have, then I'm not doing something right. Part of my job as an educator is to connect my students to a community, because I may not always be there. And sometimes my self-care requires me to unplug. There's been times that I've not able to have been there for my students. Tom mentioned Jody, and Jody and I had a conversation the other day, and Jody mentioned that, you know, he knows that there's times because of his own trauma and some of the loss that he's experienced during this moment, that he hasn't always been able to be fully present for every single one of his students exactly when they need it. But because there's a community, he gets to go take care of himself, right? And we get to do that as a squad, and we get to be really intentional about that. And if you don't have a squad, hit me, because I'm all about creating community, right? Some of us are in jobs where we are the only one in this work. Like sometimes it's like that. I hope that that's not all of you, but sometimes you're the lone voice, right? And so if that's the case, hit me up. I think the final slide has social media contacts and email, and as well as I can, or even on Whova. I'm still learning it and figuring out where you all are on Whova. But the workbook too has my contact information. Sometimes we need to intentionally create a squad because it doesn't exist within our spaces, and that's okay too.
Thank you, Dr. Ault. I also see we have another question from Rebecca, kind of touching along, you know, how to engage with our students. Do you have any ideas on how we can create these spaces for youth during COVID and distance learning?
That's a really awesome question. I've been around the country, not literally because I can't travel, but I've been around the country virtually, probably more in the last 6 months than ever. And around the world, actually. I got up at 7 o'clock this morning for a conversation in the UK. So I'm like learning all these best practices. And some things that folks are doing is they're opening up kind of office hours, where young people can come and congregate and have conversations and meet with us directly outside of the classroom. And they're really clear that my office hours aren't not for academic help, right? Like this is a wellness space. Come and get this, come and experience community with adults. They've also connected with children on social media. I don't know about your school's policies around those things. And even if you create like a specific social media platform to engage with your students. I've got teachers engaging with students on TikTok, and they talk mess about you, trust me. And they watching because they wouldn't have been able to talk mess if they wasn't watching. And so thinking about creative ways of engagement. Also, I've had, for my own college students, I've created a coffee hour or a water cooler chat. And so I'll open up Zoom before I even get there and allow them time to like hallway chat is what some scholars have called it. So Zoom, if I'm not supposed to start till 9, I'll open up my Zoom at 8:30. Anyone who wants to come early can connect with each other, and I will turn off my camera and I'll turn on mute, and I'm still getting ready for class, but they're as if they were in the hallway connecting with each other. And then also reaching out to community members. You know, building a relationship with community is one of the things that changed my practice more than anything else that I've ever done. Was two things: one, authentic, deep relationships with young people, like filled with love, and two, authentic, deep relationships with community filled with love. And so there's times when I may not be able to reach all of my students, but community members can. And so thinking about how we create those spaces as well. And I will continue to think about other ways of doing that, because folks are doing some really creative things around the world, because I think all of us are feeling that extra anxiety because it is distance learning. Breakout sessions, I know all y'all on this Zoom because y'all know how to do all that stuff, but some teachers don't know how to do breakout sessions. And so teaching your colleagues how to hold a great breakout session on Zoom, for many of our young people, that's the time where they're, you know, the teacher ain't in there. And so whether it, you know, part of the time they're working on the project collectively, and part of the time they're communicating with each other. And so being intentional about your classroom spaces, that they're not just talking at, but that they're allowing spaces for students to engage with each other as well.
I'm also curious, Dr. Ault, earlier you mentioned a little bit about, you know, trauma symptoms, and as we begin to, you know, not sure how soon this will happen, but transitioning out of this distance learning framework, what are some tips that you have in terms of, you know, for educators, administrators, on addressing, you know, someone that might be experiencing these symptoms, and what can they do to help?
Yeah, so I would say we can do that now, right? Like there's social workers on the call who can talk about how they're connecting with their students virtually. I have a therapist that works for me in my nonprofit, and they hold therapy sessions virtually, and they don't necessarily love it, right? Like they love the engage, they wish they could be in person, but there are ways to engage with students and engage in healing, even in this time of quarantine. So I would say, know your resources, know what's on your campus, know what's available for your students. If you don't have on-campus resources, or you're in a community space, reach out to me and I'll make sure you get connected to a squad to know what resources are available for different groups in your community. Some of these are little things like text, like you can text Steve to, oh my gosh, someone can probably tell me 741-741. If a student is in crisis and texts Steve to 741-741, they'll find a crisis counselor that can help talk with them and get them connected to resources in Sacramento and around the country, actually. So I would say being really mindful of those students' symptoms, doing wellness checks with your students, making sure that you have resources in your back pocket to connect them to. There are mental health hotlines. There's a mental health hotline that operates in Sacramento that I have used for young people in my life, that is a community hotline that does not use law enforcement or formal mental health spaces. And I can send that in the chat as well. But I feel like this moment has opened up just an abundance of resources. And have that, you know, once you come back to campus or even virtually, have that school social worker or wellness person on your campus. Oftentimes folks may share one, right? Like there may be a social worker for 2 or 3 schools, but see if they've got 15 minutes to come into your classroom and talk a little bit about what they do. Or think about mental wellness youth. There's a big push in Sacramento for youth mental wellness champions. I had some young people go through an amazing training this summer, put on by Cities Rise and people reaching out, where they learned how to be peer counselors and attend to or be a bridge between formal supports and their peers. And so, yeah, I'm like, could regurgitate that question for hours, but I think it's being mindful of those symptoms, checking in with your young people and ask them how they're doing. And then, you know, having these referrals, not where students have to ask for it necessarily, but where it's a natural part of your conversations. I share with all of my students my own struggles with my own mental health, with my own anxiety and depression. And I create a space where I talk about the ways that I've engaged in my healing. And I've done this for years. And that has been not only freeing for me to be authentic, but also allowed students to realize, oh, this is, you know, this is something that happens in communities of color as well. And that it's not, it's not a bad thing to ask for help if you're struggling. We've seen a rise in suicides. We've lost some people locally. And so having, you know, the suicide hotline in your phones to be able to connect young people if necessary, using the crisis lines. Some groups of youth that are at historical risk, our LGBTQIA+ youth are, you know, at historical risk and contemporarily for suicide and mental health needs, Black youth as well, other youth of color, being really intentional about having a space where youth can articulate how they're feeling and then getting them connected to the resources. Because wellness is like the prevention side, right? Like we want to prevent, like all of this kind of things, the strategies that we talked about today are prevention strategies. There are things that we can do that we can model with our students, the yoga, the breathing, the dancing, the artwork, the voice, the identity. All of those things are wellness strategies, critical wellness. One of my colleagues calls it. And sometimes we need to move to a higher level of care and a higher level of support. And so that's where we need to be, you know, you don't have to be the social worker, but you should have the name of the social worker and their number in your phone, right? So that you can connect your students. And a warm-blooded handoff is so important, so that you're not just, oh, you can call this person. I mean, those are the things that you can give students at the beginning of the year and every time you meet if you want. But if you know a student is in a crisis, I've had teachers sit with students until the social worker came out to do a suicide assessment. And that was so powerful that the student knew that that teacher was going to stay with them while they were in crisis. I've had teachers show up at hospitals. I've had teachers show up at homes. So being courageous in the way that you love and the way that you show up for your students is also really important.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ault, for answering that. And I know there's a lot of things that, you know, we can do and we can start to consider as we move forward with, you know, continuing to connect with our youth. We have time for one more question, as I just put in the chat in case anyone has, you know, a question or comment, final comments they'd like to share. Encourage you to put those in now. I see Crystal, you know, just a thank you through exclamation marks. So I feel the energy through the screen. Any other questions? You know, we'd love to be able to answer those here. But, you know, as you're seeing on the screen, Dr. Ault has provided, you know, a lot of great methods of contacting her, whether it's through social media, also the website or Instagram or LinkedIn. So feel free to reach her there. I don't know if you have any final comments, Dr. Ault. I'm not seeing any more questions come through the chat.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having me and letting me spend a couple hours with you. It flew by, and yet still wasn't enough, right, for many of us. So feel free to reach out. If you're in the South and want to come by, we can wear masks. but hit me up. Also on social media has just some, is one of the ways that I communicate different things that are happening in different ways you can get connected. You can also go to rageproject.org and sign up there for just additional information. If you're interested in donating any monetary funds to young people who are specifically looking for healing supports, we have a Black therapist. We have, we use funds to just enhance the healing space. I wish I could show you, it's beautiful. Go to Instagram, you'll see it, or even on the website, you'll see it. But we buy guided journals for young people, and just other ways of connecting young people to those healing supports is so important. So I would love to stay connected with you all. And if you need additional support at your school site and you want some more training for your teachers or your staff, or even just to hold a healing circle, trauma stewardship, sometimes we can do the wellness on our own. Sometimes we need someone to hold space for us. And so if you need that or any coaching or any additional support, I've got amazing folks I can connect you with. So reach out. As well as if you love the workbook, I'd love to hear how you're using it, as well as take feedback. It's something new that we put together, just, you know, I've only shared it a few times as part of our presentation. So if you enjoyed it, let me know. I'd love to hear how you're using some of the exercises or some of the answers to the key questions and whether they were helpful for you even in your healing journey.
Yeah, and the workbook again is available on Whova. You can download it there. And thank you so much, Dr. Ault, for making that available to everyone. And you know, just for the great discussion that we've had today. I know I've learned a lot personally, and I know you know, just based on the chats that we've been seeing come through and the dialogue, everyone's been super engaged. And you know, thank you for everyone who is at home or at work on the other side of the screen joining us today. On behalf of the Health Education Council, we also just want to inform you that today is the first day of our summit, and we will be continuing over the course of the next 3 weeks. So we encourage you to explore this new virtual platform, and you can create your own discussion board as an extension of this conversation, and contribute to some of those existing discussion boards that have a variety of topics. We really want to have this as a virtual networking opportunity as much as possible, as we're, you know, still trying to cope through these uncertain times. But we've created some internal discussion boards on behalf of our staff with topics relating to wellness. We've also set up some different meetups throughout these next 3 weeks. So please join the discussion boards, use them to your advantage, and encourage you to also network with each other, invite more folks to register. We still have a lot of openings. We still have a lot of openings for our summit. So even though people didn't get a chance to sign up before today, please continue to share. We have more great sessions coming up throughout the next few weeks. This one will also be recorded and posted as well, so folks that were not able to attend today will also be able to listen to Dr. Ault's presentation. We also encourage you to look over our schedule. Agendas posted in various areas. You can go on the agenda tab or download it as well. We hope that you can join us tomorrow at 3 o'clock as well. We will be having a discussion on prevention, intervention, and cessation resources regarding relating to tobacco and vaping, followed by a live Q&A by our presenters, Carrie Hess from the Health Education Council and Scott Kaiser from Twin Rivers Unified School District. So with that, I will conclude our kickoff day today, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow or throughout the rest of the 3 weeks. So thank you all so much, and we really hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, you're staying safe, and please continue those discussions throughout our discussion boards. Thank you so much.